So I'm going to give you permission for just a second to look at your watch or look at your phone and figure out what time it is. So, what time is it? Okay, so almost 8:50. So I promise I won't go until 9:50, okay? I promise I will be shorter than that. And has anybody ever had a time where you've looked at your watch and then somebody asks you what the time is and you can't remember what you just looked at? Or you go and you look at the weather forecast and then somebody asks you what the weather's going to be tomorrow and it's gone out of your mind. And part of the reason for that is it's right here on your phone or on your wrist to be able to look at, and so you don't store it in your mind. And yet, how many of our lives are structured and ordered by time? I've got to be here at 9 o'clock. I've got to be done with this by 9:30 so I can get on the road at this point and I can have 15 minutes of travel to get to this point and be here. And here's how my day looks out, and it's mapped out with precision that would make a calculus major jealous. And we do, I think, sometimes order our lives according to time as far as the calendars or as far as a watch can measure. And I think, for example, we know it's December 1st, and we as church, we mark time, so we begin a season, we begin Advent. But I think there's another type of time that we are aware of that we may not think about as much, but it's the time in which we live. And that's the type of time that we don't have control over. Yes, we may know that, for example, December 25th is Christmas. We may know that, every 4 years there's an election. So, that 2020 is an election year, for example. You know those things, but the reality is there's a lot of things in your life that determine the time in which you live that you don't have any control over. And this is where I think Ecclesiastes, where it talks about there's a time for war, there's a time for peace, there's a time for rising up, there's a time for lying down, there's a time for all these different things. And the reality is we don't get to set what those times are. We live in the time in which we find ourselves. And I think a lot of people spend their lives looking forward to the time that's coming rather than the time that they live in. Have you ever said, hey, I'll be happy when I have this happen? I'll be happy when I graduate college. Oh, well, now I'll be happy when I get that next promotion. Oh, well, now I'll be happy when I make $100,000. Okay, well, and you check those things off the list and you're still not there and you keep pushing that further and further down the road. I'll live when the future comes. And I think there are lots of types of Christianity that are out there that have found themselves kind of trying to predict the time and, when is this time when Christ is going to come? When is this time when, how do we say what this time that we live in is so that we know how long we have to endure it so that we can be at this point that's going to come at some later date? And I think what Jesus wants us to be able to do is not worry about the future, but be able to live the life that we live and be the people who we are called to be in the time that we are given. Whether that's a time of conflict, whether that's a time of peace, whether that's a time of divisions or whether that's a time of unity, whether that's a time where it seems like it's a time where we were made to live in, or whether it seems like we were made for a different time. And we all have parts of our life that fit into pieces of where we are and what we are doing. Whether we... I'm going to tell a story I remember from... I'd gone, when I was doing my internship up in Wisconsin, there was a person who had been in the Army with me who also lived in Wisconsin. He'd gone off and gone to an engineering job. I'd gone into ministry. And so I went to go visit him at his house. And as I was walking around his house, now he grew up in the Northeast, so he grew up on Rhode Island. And so his house was just full of pictures of lighthouses. I mean, everywhere you went into the bathroom, there's a little lighthouse there in the bathroom. And you go walking all throughout the house. There's pictures of lighthouses all over the place, and it's like, wow, this is such a huge part of his identity. And it was one of these things where, wow, this is such a huge part of his identity. I don't have a unifying kind of theme like this, and that is kind of that piece of, yeah, my life is a whole bunch of different pieces put together. It's kind of like a mosaic. It's all these different things, and and Kevin, I knew him well enough to know that his life was that way too. He just was a better decorator than I am, or his wife was. I'm not sure which, but we all have these different parts of our life that fit together, that make us who we are, that equip us for whatever task that we've been placed in. Some things fit it really well in that time. Other pieces, it's like, I don't know what to do with this little yellow piece. Where am I going to put this? How's this going to fit in? Somehow it all works. Somehow God has made us to be these people who are fit for the time that we live in, who are people who are able to be present with ourselves, with others. That somehow we have a gift to bring to that time because of the person that God has made us to be. I remember, and it's funny the things you remember sometimes. So I remember I was sitting, this is when I was at A&M, I was a cadet getting ready to go into the Army, and I was sitting in the office of one of my advisors, and so he had this picture on his wall. Now, this is not the picture, but it was a soldier standing guard at the DMZ in Korea in the middle of winter. And he had that picture on his wall because he went back and forth between Fort Hood and Korea, back and forth. But that was one of the places where he'd been stationed. He'd been stationed up on the DMZ, on that border between North Korea and South Korea. And part of his unit had to go out and stand guard on that border, whether it was blazing hot or whether it was freezing cold. And I know some people wonder why in the world, when it's freezing cold out there, I'm still out there greeting people and shaking hands for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever before the service starts. That's part of the reason, is to still have that burned in my mind of a person standing out in colder weather than I've ever had to stand out in, just standing there, standing guard, and having to stand still. But part of that is that sense of, I can endure this for a time. I can be what I need to be for this time. And again, part of it is, accepting the person who we've been shaped and formed to be. And again, I have a lot of images of different times in my life. One of the images is on pictures on my wall is again, another picture that was when I was in the Army, on the walls of every squadron in the regiment, because it was actually a picture of the regiment traveling through Utah in a snowstorm, and it's a picture called "Never a Complaint." And again, those are things that have fitted me well for certain parts of my life. They don't fit me well for this type of place. That place where you go out and you sit on the beach and you just rest and you watch the sunset and everything. I don't sit well. I've had to learn at times to sit. I've had to learn at times to be patient. I've had to learn at times how to be in that time, in that place. But I also know I'm much more comfortable being in that place, in that time where, for some reason, I'm under stress. Or for some reason, there's all these things going on, and I've got to be able to tend to it, manage it. And I think part of it is learning to be in those times where you're going, and to be in those times where you rest. And again, what rest looks like for me may be different from what rest looks like for somebody else. And that's okay. But I do think what this is all about, when Jesus talks about, a person being out in the field and one person being, two people trying to do their jobs and doing their jobs the best they can, and things happen around them, or two women grinding meal and doing the best they can and things happen around them. The reality is there are things we cannot control. There are things that will happen in this world that we may or may not be able to intervene with. But if we spend all of our lives preparing for the tornado that may never happen, or living in fear of an illness that may affect ourselves or a loved one, or being continually worried about, what could happen with our finances or our kids or all these other things. If there's these times, I think, where we take that moment that we have that time of joy and we look at that and say, "Oh, but this will never last." And so we predict all the things that can go wrong with it, and we make it go away. And I'm not saying that we don't look to the future, but we live in the present. But we live with the gifts that God has given us in this time and in the present. And, there are gifts in this time. Now, are there times where God will give us times that are fuller, that are richer, that perhaps have more meaning or more depth? Absolutely. Are there times where we may be wandering and all we can do is that which is immediately before us? Absolutely. But let's not take those times that are rich and make them poor because we're worried about the future, a future that may or may not ever happen. Let's not take the times that are joyous and make them sorrowful because we're afraid of what might happen in the midst of that joy. I do think that part of this, we aren't given to know the time beyond the time on the watch or the time on the wall. We can measure that, we can mark that. But we're not in control of everything. And that's a blessing. I don't want God's job. I really don't. What we do have is time as a gift. What we do have is we have a God who we come to know as a God who is loving and gracious. Yes, sometimes we may encounter that differently. But we fundamentally, as Christians, especially as Lutheran Christians, we come to a God who we believe is a gracious God. And a God who gives us the parts of our life that fit us for whatever that time that we find ourselves may be. And so in this season where I know that there are a lot of things that you can be stressed about, I know that there are a lot of things that can be difficult. I know that there are things that want to pull you forward faster and faster and faster. I remember being a kid and watching the Advent candles progress 1, 2, 3, 4, and wishing them to go faster and faster and faster. I had no idea that as an adult I would want to be saying, "Go slower, go slower, go slower, go slower." And yet I think somewhere in the midst of that, between the go faster and the go slower, is to be present in that time. To trust that in this day, that this is a day that God has given, and God has given us everything that we need for it. That the people that we spend it with are a gift. That the places we spend it in are a gift. That the time that is allotted to us, it is a gift. You don't need to know the future. You have the present to live in today. So take this day that the Lord has given. Rejoice and be glad in it for the gift that it is. Amen.